Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education and information to inspire collaboration and action, with me, Nigel Lake in New York, and my co-host in San Francisco, Paul Herman, for today's special event, Equal Forever After, and exploring a whole series of issues to do with LGBTIQ rights. I'm going to say just one thing at the beginning, which is please do just introduce yourselves to each other in the chat, say hello, tell us where you are, share with us your things that you're interested in, and we will work to cover those. And of course, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A function as well, and we will do our level best to weave them into the discussion. So with that, I will hand over to Rick to introduce the show and introduce our guests. Rick, welcome.
Thanks, Nigel. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rick Mordesovich, and I have lived in the Bay Area for the past 20 plus years, and I absolutely love it here. I am so grateful. However, I realize that I live in a bubble. I'm so fortunate to be legally married to the man that I love. I'm from a very small town in Ohio and was raised Catholic. I hope you get it. I never dreamed in a million years that I would be, growing up, that I would be married to a man. The evening that RBG died, I wrote a post on my Facebook, and it was a quote, and it said, "If you've never had a Supreme Court case decide if you have the same rights as others, you have privilege." I never post anything political on Facebook. It's just not worth it, and things are just too amped up and heated now. But this post reminds me of the high school girl who friended me back in 2008, even though we were never friends in high school. And I haven't seen her since graduation day in June 1983. Mine is Mary Ellen Dean. She decided to write on my wall, "First Amendment, we all have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Never been denied it a day in my life, nor had any other American. Marriage is not a right. It is a between God and woman. Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry if that offends you." Ironically, I did a bit of research on Mary Ellen Dean. I forgot who she was. And turns out she's divorced. And her Facebook page is filled with bitter and angry posts. Some people just don't get it. I'm fortunate that I have terrific clients who are amazing people who have built tremendous wealth. They're philanthropic, they give back, they love and respect me and socialize with me and my husband. A few years back, I had one of my clients ask me about the military don't ask, don't tell policy. She said, "I don't know why anybody cares who people sleep with. Live and let live. I don't advertise who I sleep with, who cares?" So I took a pause and a breath and thought, how do I answer this question eloquently? And I had to explain that it wasn't at all about sex. It was about military survivor benefits. It was about pensions. It was about who gets your remains if you're killed in action in battle. Your parents are considered your next of kin if you don't list anyone else, if you're not legally married. The military would have no idea of knowing who your partner is or who you're married to if you weren't allowed to serve openly and honestly. Then she got it. She understood, she apologized, she thanked me for my contribution or for my thoughts. She had never thought of that. It never occurred to her, and why would it? I have more than 100 stories like this, and I love that all my clients feel comfortable enough to ask me these questions. However, not everyone's a Rick. And not all people are as evolved enough to think to ask questions or to be curious or thoughtful. A lot of people are like Mary Ellen Dean. Before marriage equality, our straight friends enjoyed over 1,100 rights and benefits on the federal level that we did not. Our job is to continue to fight the fight, to educate people on LGBTQI issues, on equality. And today I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the Hip Investor, Newday, Outright, Pottinger, and Sonoma Private Wealth. I also want to do a shout out to Berkeley, Stanford, and Startout for their support with this event. And we are honored to have a roundtable discussion today with Jessica Stern, Executive Director of Outright Action International, Victor Madrigal-Borloz, Secretary General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims, and UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Pedro Pina, Vice President, Global Client and Agency Solutions at Google, and Ricky Nathanson, founder of Trans Research, Education, Advocacy, and Training. Our panel will be moderated by my friend, Kate Kendall, the Interim Legal Director from Southern Poverty Law Center, and many of you know her as the former Executive Director of the NCLR, National Center for Lesbian Rights here in San Francisco. Kate, take it away.
Thanks so much, Rick, and hello, everyone. It's great to have you here, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with Jessica and Victor, with Ricky and with Pedro. We're going to start off with Jessica and Victor because I, like so many of you, have found myself hyper-focused on what's happening in the United States. The dumpster fire that is happening electorally and how many people are being terrorized by this current administration. And as we get closer and closer to Election Day, I think I, like many, share a heightened sense of anxiety and concern about the future. But that's just here. There's so many other places in the country, and Nigel touched on this, Rick touched on this. Even with some of the worst that's happening in this country, everyone on this call, I would venture to guess, is relatively insulated from the worst behaviors of this administration, and certainly from some of the most egregious and horrific incidents of discrimination and harassment and abuse that are going on internationally. So Jessica, my good friend from Outright International, I want to start with you and ask, given that we have this hyper focus in the United States on this election and what is going on and what is at stake, what is one or two of the key international stories that, but for so much coming at us in a tsunami of information and misinformation, what are we missing? What are we not seeing that is happening internationally that we should all be paying attention to?
Thank you, Kate, for that really easy question to start us off. No, just kidding. You've never asked an easy question in your life.
Not my job.
And I want to start off by thanking the organizers very much for convening this space, and thank everyone for joining. You know, Kate, I think for people that think primarily in terms of domestic policy, you're missing the urgency that the global human rights struggle has. And when we look specifically at the struggle for LGBTIQ rights globally, we're really talking about a life and death struggle that has become an epicenter in the fight against totalitarianism, in the fight for the rule of law, and in the fight around the question of whether minorities are entitled to have rights. So these are really essential questions. And the way I think of the issues, I think that LGBTIQ rights in many countries were seen as offensive, distasteful, perverted, or immoral at a certain point, maybe let's say 20 years ago. But today, the LGBTIQ movement is seen as successful. And with that comes backlash. And so what we've seen in recent years are a raft of new laws that make it really hard to be alive as a queer person, to have a job, to have housing, and really difficult to fight for our rights. So some examples of those laws include laws banning foreign funding of civil society organizations, laws censoring access to information online about LGBTIQ rights, or even equating LGBTIQ information with child abuse. And actually, one of the most painful laws that we've seen come into existence that's either a new category of law or a distortion of existing laws is when LGBTIQ people gather to protest, to organize, to talk about our rights, the opposition will sometimes say they're coming together for a gay marriage. And what could be more offensive to so-called traditional values? And I find that last piece to be extremely dangerous. And that's part of what we're missing at the global level. Because if every time LGBTIQ people talk about our rights, we're accused of having a wedding, first of all, we would be broke because we would have bought gifts for all of our friends so many times over that there'd be nothing left. But more importantly, we would deny LGBTIQ people the rights given to others, like free speech, like assembly, like the right to protest. And if I could just share with you one quick example that I think illustrates this point. Right now, Outright is working on a case in Ghana where two people actually did have a commitment ceremony, but instead of it being a private event where they shared love with their families and friends, news of the commitment ceremony leaked to the press. And there was a kind of systematic attack on them. So they've now been outed in every tabloid media you can imagine. One of them is in the military. That person has been court-martialed. And people that attended the commitment ceremony have even been demoted from their jobs as it became known that they went to the ceremony. And so I think part of what we're missing globally is that if LGBTIQ people live with safety and security in one country, then we have not only an obligation, but a huge opportunity to use that privilege in the service of LGBTIQ people around the world who are literally fighting for life and death.
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. Victor, it's great to see you and have you here. You have a really important role with the imprimatur of the United Nations behind it. But before I have you discuss a little bit about that role, I'm curious about how you would answer the same question. What do you think are the one or two international stories involving the lives of queer people that we're failing to attend to because of the onslaught of information in this country and what's driving that fear?
Thank you very much, Kate. I'm looking to you to make sure that you can hear me well. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And of course, a very daunting task to follow the wonderful Jessica Stern, who's always so articulate and so able to encapsulate worlds in a few sentences. I think what I would complement in relation to that is the fact that LGBT lives have enormous diversity around the world. And in fact, even the use of an acronym such as LGBT is something that is not uniformly embraced by people belonging to gender diversities or sexual orientation diversities around the world. The reality is that everyone in the world, Kate, has a sexual orientation and a gender identity. We need to take that as a point of departure. And that problems of discrimination and violence related to those very human traits are as diverse as people themselves. I wish I could give in a few sentences an idea of the enormous differences that exist around the world in the problems that people face. Think about this. As of today, a staggering 2 billion people, that's 2,000 million people, almost a third of the world population, lives in criminalized environments. It means that almost a third of the world population lives in environments in which either homosexuality or lesbianism or some forms of diverse gender identity are criminalized, in some cases with the death penalty. Think about the consequences of that environment in the way people live their lives and the way that they are able to relate to the information that they convey publicly and to the state, to relate to it in realms such as employment and education and housing and even health. So the limitations imposed by that reality are in fact staggering. And then move on to environments that may not be criminalized, but in which criminalization historically exists and carved deep grooves. And also in reality in which pathologization, the notion that LGBT lives are somehow disordered or ill, also created some sort of social perceptions there. The levels of exclusion that I have witnessed in my travels around the world are something that are actually quite fundamental. And even, and I was quite motivated to follow up on one point that Jessica made, which is even in context in which enormous progress has been made, the reality of backlash is ever present. The possibility that rights that have been in some way hard fought and hard achieved through, literally through blood and tears, may be taken away by the stroke of a pen or a judgment of a particular court. That is the reality, the granularity in the reality of LGBT lives that includes instances of terrible cruelty and, of course, very existential, very real, everyday aspects that affect the ability of people to seek happiness.
Wow. Well, between the two of you, it's really, it hits home how lethal it is to be LGBTQI identified in so many places in the country. And you think about that number 2 billion, Victor, that's over 6 times the population of the United States. And so it really does. I mean, think about that. Think about, we think this is, we're such a, we understand other countries have more population, but when you think about how many people are living with such fragility about their ability to be honest and open with who they are and face the real daily prospect of horrific abuse or death, it's important just to understand and to not curl up in the fetal position, but to understand that that our privilege does have context, that we do have relative privilege. And so then the charge is, well, what are we going to do with that privilege and how are we going to deploy it? So Victor, your role is very unique, and it demonstrates, at least to me, that the powers that be at the UN understand the importance of sexual orientation diversity in the world and gender identity diversity in the world. Can you talk a little bit about your role, how long you've been in the position, and what your charge is?
Of course. A couple of points at the outset. The first one is the role was created in 2016 as the result of intense and very, very well-sustained advocacy by hundreds, over 1,000 organizations coming, we believe, from over 174 countries. So civil society played a fundamental role in ensuring that this happened, not least Outright International, represented here by Jessica Stern. That energy coming from these organizations that were providing the evidence as to why sexual orientation and gender identity must be a point of entry in the deconstruction of violence and discrimination met sympathetic action by a coalition of states. And eventually, after a very, very, very arduous process at the international level, the mandate was created in 2016. I'm the second mandate holder. The first one was a very nice, very able professor from Thailand, who unfortunately had to resign because of health reasons. I'm in the role since January of 2018. And Kate, fundamentally, what my job is to actually ensure that there is visibility of the way in which violence and discrimination affects the everyday lived realities of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, otherwise gender diverse persons around the world. So that visibility. And then I am supposed to provide advice to states on what may be effective measures to address and deconstruct those forms of violence and discrimination. It is by no means the only point of entry. We all encompass many identities in one body, and those identities create unique experiences of privilege or discrimination, or a combination thereof. But it is a necessary point of entry. And this is what the international community acknowledged when creating this mandate and providing, in this case, me, with the job of reporting to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council once a year on these realities of suffering and obstacles in the pursuit of happiness.
Well, bless you. You're going to heaven. And the world is grateful for your work. Folks, I feel like I do want to say, as the moderator here, there are questions I'm interested in asking Victor as a follow-up, but understand that we want to moderate our time here a little bit. So know that you will have an opportunity to ask questions. We have a good chunk of time together, so think about questions that you might want to ask all 4 of our panelists as the day progresses. Jessica, an obvious question, given the pandemic, is how COVID has impacted your work. And Victor, this question is also coming to you because I saw you just issued a report about this. I think it was just yesterday, but certainly very recently. So Jessica, maybe you first can talk about what has been, certainly the impact on COVID have only made vulnerable populations more so. That obviously, that seems like an obvious conclusion, but what specifically, in a more granular way, are you seeing with COVID internationally?
Thanks, Kate, for making this conversation so timely. In response to the COVID pandemic, Outright did two things pretty quickly. The first was we issued a report about how LGBTIQ people were being impacted globally. And that report, called Vulnerability Amplified, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on LGBTIQ people internationally, is available on our website, outrightinternational.org. And I want to be really clear why it was important to develop that report. It was important to develop that report because Outright knows the history of public health crises and natural disasters. And the response historically has been that the powers that be prioritize majority populations. And so it was almost a foregone conclusion that LGBTIQ people would slip through the cracks of official responses. And so what we wanted to do was not wait. We didn't want to wait for higher infection rates or more deaths by LGBTIQ people. We wanted to sound the alarm early. And so what we did was we interviewed 59 people who were some of the world's most accomplished LGBTIQ activists from 50 countries around the world. And we asked them, what are you seeing in the early days of the pandemic, and what policy interventions are going to help save members of your community? And the report really gives a robust set of recommendations, because we don't need to wait for disaster to take action to make sure people are going to be safe. And what we found was really startling. And what we found was that the overwhelming number of people that we interviewed described how their community was experiencing hunger and homelessness almost immediately. And so you have to ask yourself, why was the LGBTIQ community so impacted economically even before the full health effects rippled across the community? And it speaks to the pre-existing conditions. And so what it really emphasizes is that LGBTIQ people were living on the razor's edge of poverty before the pandemic hit. And so all it took was one day where they couldn't go to work because there wasn't enough money in the bank account, right? They were fragile before, and then you have one life-changing event and poof, the stability just disappears. And so as important as it was to have that research, we also wanted to do something very tangible immediately. And so we set out to create a COVID LGBTIQ emergency fund. And the focus of it was very specific. We knew that LGBTIQ organizations would be the first responders for many LGBTIQ people around the world. Why do we know that? Because a lot of the official first responders are governments and religious organizations. Governments and religious organizations have not been friends to LGBTIQ people in every setting. Some are great, but unfortunately, in emergencies, we couldn't take a risk. And so we set out to fund LGBTIQ organizations working on the front lines around the world with grants anywhere from $2,500 up to $10,000 to do literally anything their community needed. And I'm really happy to say that with a lot of support from a lot of extraordinary partners, we managed to raise $1.2 million. And so far, we've actually distributed 114 grants to groups on the front lines. And I guess what I would say is a data point that came in from that experience, Kate, was about the need. And the need really emphasized what we learned in our research report. Domestic violence skyrocketed. Scapegoating of LGBTIQ people skyrocketed. There was one government that tried to use the excuse of the pandemic to sneak a law through saying that they would suspend bail bonds for people arrested for sodomy because that would create heightened public health risk in the pandemic. You can't even imagine this. But actually what happened was we received 1,500 applications from around the world, and a whopping 57% of them were for emergency food relief. And I have to say, like, poor Victor, we've presented about the impact of COVID, so he's heard me say this so many times, but it still makes me so angry that that was the first response of our community because we were so unsafe to begin with. And I want to say the thing that I also learned is about where we go from here. And that is that if the first wave was characterized by food scarcity for our community, the second wave is going to be characterized by the fragility of LGBTIQ organizations. And experts are saying that COVID could be an, quote, extinction level event for human rights organizations. Now imagine how young and fragile the global LGBTIQ movement is. We can't afford to lose even one group, much less be set back years.
I'm so struck by the food insecurity piece because that's so elemental and basic, and we all understand that. And that would be the need. We all understand and we all realize that we're living lives and have been living lives for the last few months with just a diminishment of joy, a diminishment of human connection. We all feel that, but I don't think anyone on this call worries about where their next meal is coming from. And to understand that just means, again, it doesn't mean that we're immobilized by the task is too great. It means we have to face what's real with clear-eyed vision and then help to come together united around a response. And I'm really grateful that you had the response you did to your call for donations. Victor, you put out a study about the impact of COVID. What would you add to what Jessica said? And then we're gonna finish up with Victor's answer to this, folks, and then we're gonna bring in Ricky and Pedro to join this really important conversation. Victor.
Thank you, Kate. Just like what Jessica was mentioning at the outset of the pandemic, I think that it was a very common trait that nobody had foreseen exactly what was going to happen, but it very quickly became evident that it was going to be a major event. And I think that Outright really tapped into the spirit of the matter when they talk about vulnerability amplified. Because I think that the idea is that we didn't come to a situation that was completely new. We came to a situation in which systemic exclusion made it so that LGBT people didn't come to the pandemic in a level playing field. So what the pandemic functioned like was as a magnifying glass into a situation that existed already, and it basically got multiplied many times over in speed and in intensity by the realities brought forth by the pandemic. My colleague Hilal Ever, the special rapporteur on right to food, has called the pandemic inequality on steroids. And I think that this is a very, very telling expression for what has been happening in relation to the pandemic. My report built on a number of reports, not least of which is, of course, the fantastic Vulnerability Amplified issued by Outright International. And what I did is I wanted to report to the General Assembly of the United Nations. I will present this report on 29 October at the Third Committee of the General Assembly, which typically convenes in New York. So very, very soon I'll be presenting this report to the Third Committee, to the international community. And my lines of findings were basically three that mirror what Jessica was telling you, but from the angle of state responsibility, Kate. So first line of finding is a number of states have used the pandemic to persecute LGBT persons. There is no doubt about that. I'm on the record, for example, denouncing the infamous Article 33 in Hungary's legislation that withdraws the ability of trans persons to obtain legal recognition of their gender identity at a time when it is most important for people's documents to correspond with their gender expression, for example. So the level of cruelty that one has to imagine devises this at a time when people need it most is what's striking. That's only one example. I could give you many. They're all in the report. Second, even in cases where states are not devising these measures to persecute people, the absence of LGBT people at the table where the measures are designed are creating enormous instances of indirect discrimination. This is when a norm is seemingly neutral, but when applied, it actually deploys a discriminatory impact. Disparate impact or disproportionate impact is the way that this is known in the United States kind of legal jargon. You have this, for example, as the impact of gender-based quarantines in Latin America, or the attribution of distribution of food and health supplies by community and religious leaders in communities. All of these instances that would appear neutral, but because the implementation mechanisms are discriminatory, they end up operating in a discriminatory way. And the third, Kate, is the finding that I think Jessica alluded so ably to, which is LGBT people didn't come to the pandemic on a level playing field. They came as bearing a legacy of discrimination and exclusion that creates for them indicators that are consistently lower than the rest of the population. Think about this for a second. Out of every 10 youth that is homeless, where data exists, 4 will identify as LGBT. Consistently, LGBT people, lesbian women in particular, have lower health outcomes than the rest of the population because of systematic exclusion from the health sector. And a gay man all around the world, where data exists, is found to be only half as likely to be invited back to a work interview. All of this has very specific consequences in the level of economic well-being of persons as coming with the pandemic, where, as we all know it, your ability to rely on savings and credit is fundamental to have written out so far the impact of the pandemic. In the light of that, Kate, and with this I will finish, I issued a framework which is called the Aspire framework that I communicated to all of the states of the United Nations, almost 200 states. It's called the Aspire framework. That's a mnemonic device calling to acknowledge that LGBT people are everywhere and are hard hit with the pandemic, to support LGBT-led and LGBT-serving organizations, such as Outright International, which precedes me. They have been doing fundamental work in supporting the global network of organizations that is responding to this. Protect LGBT persons from violence and discrimination. Indirect discrimination is a real risk. Assess it and bring it into your risk management. Representation is key. You need to have people from the concerned communities in the table where response and recovery is designed. And finally, evidence-based approaches are fundamental. We need to act from evidence and not from preconception and stigma. Hopefully, this will be a framework for states to follow up on. And this is, Kate, what my conversation with the international community will be next week when I present this report and elaborate further on these guidelines with the communities of states at the General Assembly of the UN.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Victor. And I did see in the chat, both Outright International's report is posted, Victor's report is posted along with the framework. So tons of resources, and we'll continue to follow up and send out anything else that people are asking for. At this point, I want to invite Ricky Nathanson and Pedro Pina to join our conversation. Ricky and Pedro are, I'm meeting them both for the first time, but what a fantastic couple of individuals that they are. And I have some questions for both of them. Ricky, I want to start with you, if you don't mind. And what I want to start with a little bit and have you lay out for folks is a little bit of your biography. You are currently living in the United States. but the US is not your home country. I imagine that maybe you would like to still be living in your home country of Zimbabwe, but are unable to safely do so. Can you talk a little bit about how you ended up in the United States and talk about this very, very important human rights fight that you were a part of in Zimbabwe? And welcome. It's an honor to meet you. It's a great pleasure to have you here. You are a profile in courage, and grateful that you could join us.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to everyone for inviting me on this call. I feel so intimidated following Jessica and Victor, who are both so eloquent, and they are my heroes that I look up to. So yeah, I mean, as you alluded to, Kate, I have a long, painful story, but I'd say a bit victorious. And before I jump into my story, I just want to pull a few words from that were said by the previous speakers, which I want the audience to think about and to consider as I speak to you. So Rick spoke about equality. Kate, you spoke about privilege. Jessica spoke about the extinction of LGBTQ organizations, and Victor used vulnerability amplified. And all of those words can be used in the context in which I speak to you. So as you've said before, I am from Zimbabwe. I'm a transgender woman. I was very successful back home. I'm a chartered secretary, that's like a chartered accountant, had my own business, had my own organization. And what happened was in 2014, I was arrested at the instigation of a high-level political leader in my home city of Bulawayo, simply for appearing the way that I do here. The arrest and the treatment that I received were horrific. I was arrested at gunpoint by 6 police officers at rifle point. I was locked in a very dark cell with no lighting. I was stripped naked in front of 5 police officers, again at gunpoint. And the media frenzy that followed my arrest and the subsequent, the initial trial was crazy. I mean, I couldn't even walk to the corner store to buy a pint of milk or a loaf of bread or get a newspaper because I was being so demonized and vilified by the local press. That said, I took it upon myself I first started the Trans Research Education Advocacy and Training to be able to advocate for the rights of trans identifying people in Zimbabwe, and that I'm pleased to say is still going very strong and has grown from strength to strength. But then I also did something which I was afraid to do at first, but I felt was really necessary to protect myself and those that have come after me. I sued the government of Zimbabwe, that's the Minister of Home Affairs, the chief of police at the police station that I was arrested at, the chief commissioner, the mandate of me. It's like I sued like about 5 different people. That case was long drawn out. The lawsuit was filed in August of 2014. We went to trial in 2017, and the trial, which initially should have taken a morning, lasted 3 days because it was so complicated. And the judge really wanted to get to the bottom of the issues around the case. Judgment took over 2 years to be handed down, but fortunately for myself, and I'd say the rest of the transgender community around the world, ruling was handed down in my favor. And that has changed the landscape of trans rights in Zimbabwe and Africa across the continent.
Thank you, Ricky.
So with that said, I faced harassment and further harassment by the government because I had embarrassed them so publicly that I had to flee for my life to the United States because they tried. They actually twice. They tried to kill me back home in Zimbabwe. Kate, are you still there?
I hear you, Ricky, but it looks like Kate might be frozen.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're back, I think. Are we back? We lost you for a second, Ricky. Will you just, we understood about that you embarrassed the government, and I don't know how much more other people heard. Maybe I was just the person who froze, but could you just repeat that, Ricky, in case other folks missed it?
Yes, so as I was saying, so because I'd embarrassed the government so publicly, they tried to kill me twice, and I had to flee my home country of Zimbabwe, and I'm living in the United States, based in the Washington, D.C. region.
So, Ricky, your story is obviously chilling and also inspiring. And I find that we often have this dual reaction to people who are pioneers, who actually chart a new path that no one else has walked before. But it really does require an uncommon courage. This is not a road that many people would choose to walk. And I'm grateful that you did, not just for the lives of LGBTQ and trans people in Zimbabwe, but really worldwide, that is an example. It is an example of telling the truth to power, even at huge personal risk, but it is uncommon. It is not the sort of thing that I think many of us would have done in the same situation. And so I hope you understand that the gratitude is real for what you've done, and our concern for you and our desire to keep you safe and have you have a full life, whatever you choose to do next is real.
Thank you.
So Pedro, you're like the Sesame Street song. One of these things is not like the others, in terms of our panel today, representing, clearly a global giant in terms of your VP for Global Affairs role at Google. What I'm curious about asking you is, it's very clear to me, having been involved in queer LGBTQ legal advocacy and policy advocacy for over 2 decades, that what accelerated the win in the United States, at least the win on marriage equality, but even just a greater understanding of LGBTQ people generally, was when corporate partners got off the sidelines and actually weighed in and threw down with the struggle for LGBTQ equality in this country, and actually made policy decisions and prompted and pushed elected officials to decide things differently. I'm thinking of Mike Pence in Indiana, for example. And when Salesforce right away said, we're not going to do anything, we're not going to do business in Indiana if you sign this religious exemption bill. There are many, many other examples. Google was one of the very first entities that was willing to sign on to an amicus brief in favor of marriage equality in California, for example. But I'm curious, from your vantage point, and you have a global view, not just your position at Google, what do you think Google's getting right? And as you look at other international corporations and businesses, is there anything you'd like to steal from them, from something that somebody else might be doing that you wish Google would adopt?
Yeah, thank you for having me here. First and foremost, I have massive imposter syndrome just sitting next to these 3 massive giants and being interviewed by you. So I don't even know how to say. And coming after Ricky is just incredibly humbling, and it reminds me as well the incredible privilege that I have. I work for a wonderful company that gets it, and I get to live in a part of the world that allowed me to get married to the man I love, and to have a daughter, 16 months old daughter who I absolutely adore and changed my life. And I get to speak here today freely without any problem, and not even an inkling of an issue, similar to what, for instance, Ricky had to go through, or some of the stories that Victor or Jessica were sharing. So, I mean, just first of all, the acknowledgement of the massive privilege, and again, massive imposter syndrome, just being the big tech guy coming to speak at this panel. Now, That's right. I think the way Google is looking at LGBT rights is it's 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 just recognizing that this is about human rights. This is not about a group specifically, but this is about equity, and this is just about providing, you know, equal opportunity to everyone we serve. And and it really comes from the top. That's the one learning that really, and you saw that on Salesforce as well. It has to come from the CEOs. It has to come from the board. And our CEO is very, very clear. We want to be a reflection of the users we serve. We want to build for everyone, by everyone. And by all means, we are not yet there. Representation and equality is a journey. It takes a while to get there, because as we hire people from society, we also hiring all the biases and all the cultural norms and deviances that exist around the world, and we have to do hard work internally to make sure that we make a change and we fight for representation across the board. So we are actively working on it. This is something that naturally doesn't happen just because you embrace those values. And that's, I would say, learning number two. So no, learning number one has to come from the top. Number two, just because you embrace the values, it doesn't mean that things organically and naturally get there. It's actually a lot of hard work that it's required to get there. Lots of advocacy and lots of allyship from senior leadership. And so we are on it. We are at it, and we have operations across the world in a lot of regions where it is a crime to be an LGBTQ identified person. It endangers your physical integrity if you identify as such. But we've always believed in the so famous ambassadorship or embassy model, where, you know, inside our walls, we are who we are. We embrace these values, and you can be whom you want to be inside those walls. And with that, you can create a network of other companies that do precisely the same. And ultimately, those are the norms that start getting accepted in the communities where you can have an impact. But also, through Google, you can also do a lot of work. So even inside walls in difficult countries, you can be whomever you want. You can represent. You can be a representative of the community and do something for the community. But you can also, as a company, go broader and work in systemic issues. So, for instance, I spent some good time in the UK organization called Advertising, which is all about making sure representation happens in advertising, just because we know advertising impacts culture, and culture creates normalization. Normalization leads to acceptance. And so you know, Google is spending a significant amount of time working with organizations like this and fighting for representation also in the products we put outside will lead to cultural transformation. In parallel, we are also, now heard a lot of work that Jessica and Victor were doing on the legal front. We're also sponsoring the first community of LGBT lawmakers that is being created on a global level to come together and work on law issues, because law is the foundation of basic civil protections, let alone advancements going forward. And the best thing we can do is to provide precisely that, provide support for lawmakers to come together, share best practices, and push forward the protection of the LGBTQ plus people around the world. And finally, our own platforms. I mean, YouTube has been a huge platform to support the community. I mean, the amount of videos that we have of coming out, whether celebrities or people otherwise, young people come to YouTube all the time, especially in countries, it's interesting, especially in countries where LGBTQ rights are not protected. Or where people are particularly fragile. Those are the countries where our presence through search and YouTube is incredibly useful for the community. The amount of YouTube videos that we have on how to come out to your family, how to come out to your friends, how to feel safe, how to reach for help, how to create a community, how to make your voice heard is out of control, is huge. We created this massive community. And we can see that pulsing everywhere around the world. So Google has a disproportionate amount of impact in this area. We're very proud of it. And again, for us, it's about just simple human rights and having everyone sitting at a table and represented.
Thanks, Pedro. You know, I've stalked all of you on all of your social media platforms over the course of the last few days. And Pedro, you're no exception. And I noticed that that you do a blend of, I mean, you have your role at Google, but you're quite an activist online. And one of the things I really did love, and since you alluded to, or I'm going to raise it, you posted the hashtag Proud Boys that I so love that all my gay male friends took over after the Proud Boys shout out from President Trump at the debate. And you hashtag Proud Boys with a picture of you and your husband and your beautiful daughter, Maria. And so it seems to me like it's a little bit of how to model how you can, because there are many folks who have comfortable jobs in tech or in other sectors, and they just keep their head down and don't want to be political. They aren't activists online, they aren't activists in their private lives. And what I continue to exhort people to do when people ask me who work in the private sector, what more, what can I do? I say, be an activist, be an activist in whatever way you can in order to elevate that conversation and that voice. And it looks to me like you found a way to balance that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And would that be your advice to other folks who are in the private sector?
Absolutely. Although I have to say, to me, it's about defending human rights. It's really not political. It's so funny. We had that conversation internally at times about Black Lives Matter, and there was a chatter inside my teams globally to say, but why are we involved in this political topic? And I kept going back to my teams and said, this is not a political topic. Unfortunately, parties, in the case of the US on both sides and in other sides as well, make it a political topic. And when it comes to policy design, it will become a political topic at some point. But this is not about policy. This is about human rights. This is about equality. And this is about protecting vulnerable, underrepresented groups. So I never see it. I see it activism from human rights. I don't see it as political activism. And we need to not allow ourselves to be dragged into a conversation that makes this political. Chasten Buttigieg, the husband of Pete Buttigieg, was the other day posted this amazing post that said, LGBT rights are not up for debate. I mean, pineapple in a pizza, it's up for debate, but LGBT rights are not up for debate. It's not a partisan conversation. It's a human rights conversation. And it should be over at this point. And the only thing we have to do is to work on the elements of process and systems in society that are still there. Most of them are legacy stuff that needs to be broken down in order for us to ensure not that LGBT people have more rights, but LGBT people have equal rights to everyone else. We're not removing anything from anybody. We just want everyone to have the same opportunities and have the chance to have same chance to have a voice at decision-making tables around the world. And so again, no politics. I have very strong political points of view, but actually, in the case of LGBTQ, and if we're going to talk about Republican Democrats, I mean, Bill Clinton was notoriously the big defender of the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy some years ago, and even President Obama, if everyone remembers, had hesitations about the Marriage Equality Act. So, it's beyond political parties. It's just a human rights fight.
I really appreciate that framing. It has always been very irritating and frustrating and infuriating to me when we would advocate for corporations or government entities to take a position on a central human rights issue, and they would use the dodge of, well, we don't get involved in politics. So it's really important to make that distinction. But I am going to jump into politics with my next question to you, Jessica. I'm going to say this super quickly because I don't want to live in this place, but let's say there's not a change in administration in November. What would be strategies? What should give us optimism that we can endure and survive, and certainly that the international LGBTQ plus community can endure and survive another 4 years of this administration?
Well, Kate, asking me to be optimistic about US politics after Pedro just explained how not everything needs to be about politics feels like walking into a trap. But I really appreciate the question. It's really important. And certainly we're all eating, sleeping, and breathing the election right now. You know, to put this in a global context, what I want to say is whether you love the US's role globally or you hate the US's role globally, its influence as a superpower is beyond debate. And therefore, what the US does on LGBTIQ rights domestically and in foreign policy reverberates around the world. And I want to give some examples of the US's outsized impact globally to help people understand what's at stake with this election. So, one, the US has more embassies around the world than any other country. Two, the US has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, which is the most influential body at the United Nations. Three, the US appointed Bethany Kozma, an anti-trans activist, to be Deputy Chief of Staff at USAID, which is one of the richest and most influential development agencies in the world. And four, the US will continue its efforts to dismantle and undermine the credibility of the United Nations, which, as you've heard from Victor and you'll hear from many colleagues, is one of the most important tools the LGBTIQ movement globally has to hold governments accountable when we are criminalized in more than 68 countries globally, when we are subject to arbitrary arrest, and when governments pass laws that dehumanize us. And so the point is here that what's at stake in the US presidential election actually impacts LGBTIQ people in every country around the world. And I think we should be really clear what the threat is if Trump is reelected. There are right-wing zealots in positions of influence in US foreign policy, administering decisions and controlling millions of dollars in funding that can impact whether or not LGBTIQ organizations have a right to exist, can impact whether or not LGBTIQ people will remain arbitrarily in jail. And of course, we hear this. I want to actually make this point pretty explicit. One of the problems that we've seen in recent years in the Trump administration has been a fissure between lesbian, gay, bisexual rights and transgender rights. And that's not just in domestic policy, it's also in foreign policy. So in the sort of public language of the Trump administration, fighting the criminalization of homosexuality is a Trump administration priority. It's very confusing. Don't ask me how. It's a much longer conversation than we have time for today. But they systematically exclude transgender people from their scope of interest. Now you could say, I don't know, maybe that's actually good, because if the administration isn't consistently upholding all LGBTIQ rights, maybe we don't want them to say anything about LGBTIQ rights. And that's a debate worth having. But I will say that when the US champions lesbian and gay rights in some situations and completely neglects trans folks, what does it do? It's like that dog whistle that we're all referring to, whether it's Proud Boys or QAnon or any other hateful message. It says that attacks on transgender people are acceptable, permissible, and in some cases encouraged. And I can't say enough about how dangerous that is. I think Ricky's bravery in standing up to the government of Zimbabwe strikes a chord with a lot of us, because this kind of violence against trans people, it's not just happening in Zimbabwe, it's not just happening in the US, it's happening everywhere. And I think you asked me to find some optimism, Kate, and I see your furrowed brow, so I'm going to try to think of something optimistic to say. And that is that like we are powerful and we are the answer. Because whether there's a Biden-Harris administration and our job is to help rebuild the pillars of democracy and the rule of law, or whether there's a Trump-Pence administration and we have to defend ourselves from dangerous attacks on our community and all of those we care about, people of color, Muslims, immigrants, etc. We have each other and we have to support each other. That is going to be the way that we survive no matter who's in the White House. And I think that's the right message, because To put it in a more global landscape, there are 14 major federal elections happening in the Western Hemisphere in the next 6 months. 14. So it's not just the US presidential election that's going to determine our way forward. So we just have to keep fighting wherever we are.
Thanks, Jessica. Completely agree with that. I've just got 2 more quick questions, one for Ricky and one for Victor, and then we're going to go to the chat, which I have not been monitoring. So I may need help from one of the many handsome men who are in a thumbnail photo on my screen to help moderate and pull out some of the questions. But Ricky, following up on what Jessica said around the violence against transgender individuals, transgender women of color specifically, in my 20 plus years at NCLR, I saw such a sea change around the understanding and the aptitude that lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, and the larger society in the United States had around trans issues. 20 years ago, no one even knew a trans person. They didn't even know what it meant to be transgender. They didn't even understand you could have a different gender identity than your sex assigned at birth. And it feels like in a very short period of time, the lifetime of my college senior son, that has totally shifted. It's still, look, the lethality is still out there, even in the streets in many cities in the United States for particularly transgender women of color. But many people can no longer say they don't have exposure to or even know personally a transgender person. And so that we've at least seen the door open to an acknowledgement that transgender exists as a way of being in the world. My question for you, certainly based on your experience in Zimbabwe, what would be if you had an audience, and you have an audience here of some influencers, what is the thing you want cisgender, non-trans individuals to understand from your perspective? You don't have to speak for the entire trans community, but from your perspective, what's the central understanding you want allies to have as we enter this work authentically and want to show up as authentic, fierce allies for our transgender brothers and sisters? What do you want us to know?
That really is a very big question, and I could spend the whole afternoon speaking. But I think that I'll sort of hang on the coattails of the initial discussion. I think we spoke about the marriage equality, especially in the United States. But speaking to equality, marriage equality, we need to look at equality as a whole and tie that into the whole human rights aspect. Okay. And speaking as a transgender woman who has experienced firsthand discrimination and the abuse of my basic human rights, there's a lot more that goes into this conversation than just my being able to go to a bathroom, and that's the reason why I was arrested. We need to take a more holistic picture and look at what makes a human being and what is it that a human being needs to exist without prejudice, without discrimination, and with fulfillment to the utmost, be it sexual fulfillment, be it a full livelihood, employment, going to bed with a full belly. I mean, the list is endless. And we cannot speak about human rights without tying them into the Sustainable Development Goals, of which I want to sort of highlight 2 or 3, actually 4 of them, which is SDG 10, which speaks to supporting marginalized and disadvantaged people. 16, which says stand up for human rights. And then I don't have the other one, which says empower women and girls to ensure equal rights. So, I mean, just those 4 of the total 17 speak to a whole gambit of human rights that are being violated against trans people. And speaking as a trans woman of color, I live in Washington, D.C., and I work for an organization run by trans women of color. Pardon me. And we, in the 17 months that I've been working at this organization in Washington, D.C., we have witnessed the death of at least 9 trans women of color that have actually come to, that we had interaction with. And that just speaks to the violence that we face as trans women of color. For simple things as walking down the street, to go to the corner store to buy whatever it was, a woman was shot. It was on the news just this week. So I mean, we speak about marriage equality, but what about the rights to life, the rights to dignity? Those are, and which to me I think are much more important than speaking to a broader topic of marriage equality, when one cannot even just merely exist by virtue of the fact of being who they were born to be or who they are. So I mean, it really is a large topic.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Victor, last question for you before we go to, I've seen a couple of questions in the chat that I'll go to, but Victor, I'm going to give you the flip side of the question I asked Jessica, and that is, let's assume this administration is showing the door on November 3rd. What does your first 60 days look like in a Biden administration? What are things that you would pick up and take the initiative and run with it? You must have a list of the if this then this. Can you give us a little bit of insight in what you think you might be able to do that maybe you couldn't have done under the current administration?
Thank you, Kate. Interestingly enough, I mean, this mandate places us outside of any particular binaries of political vicissitude. And at the same time, of course, they place us in the very, very heart of politics and policymaking. So let me try and unpack that a little bit to give you a little bit of the notion of how operating with the mandate is. Given that my interlocutors are all elected governments in the world, of course, we operate in the reality of power as it exists, right? And this relates to governments that are not very supportive at all to the existence of the mandate and governments that are extremely supportive. But the key to this is that the mandate has a mandate of dialogue with every government on earth, including those that may be not completely amenable or right down hostile to the furtherance of LGBT rights. So in that context, you can imagine that I'm given the task of always operating with realpolitik, Kate. I'm always just simply taking stock of the reality as it evolves, and I progress with it. The reality, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you, this mandate existed because the Obama administration made it a priority that the mandate would exist, and they actually deployed significant political capital for the mandate to exist. And therefore, I would be remiss if I didn't actually pay tribute to that movement that actually existed when that was the case. But we have moved along and worked around all of the issues, including those that Jessica was quite ably mentioning in relation to this. Now, a couple of observations that I cannot help but make in trying to elicit part of this conversation, Kate. First, I wonder to what extent there is a distinction between our existences being political and our existences being partisan. So place yourself, as I am, outside of the scope of the binary of the Republican and Democrat in the United States, as people who look at the world and realities in the world. I think that there is something quite political when LGBT people occupy public space, that is a statement of political being, and that LGBT people actually operating in the public sphere is a very political act. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a partisan act. It doesn't belong to the essence of Democrats or Republicans in the key of the United States or in any other key around the world. So one of the things that I would invite is the understanding that a lot of the things that we're talking about are essentially political but not partisan. They shouldn't be partisan, but they are political because they pertain to the public space and they pertain to public policy making. And to me, there's a fundamental difference there. Remember that it was not long ago that the theory was, oh, gays and lesbians, they can live their dirty lives as long as they live them in the privacy of their bedrooms, and that they are not bringing it to the public space of the employment and the health sector, and why not elected office. So I think I would invite that we try and deconstruct and disarticulate that understanding of political and partisan in a way that allows so many people to occupy public space, including Kate. There's so many of our siblings around the world that actually are not able to even occupy public space one day a year in the form of a pride parade. For so many people, this is not a simple party or a carnival. It is a matter of life and death to be able to manifest themselves and occupy public space in an act that is essentially political, because we are political when we are in the public space. That's a very quick point in relation to this. Second thing, just wanted to try and follow up in relation to something that Jessica said, which I found so compelling. There is a reason why so many administrations around the world are against the notion of gender as a notion that is necessary to deconstruct violence and discrimination. And it's because agendas are aiming at, I will use an expression that I used at the Outright World Conference last year, administrations are aiming to control the womb of people who have wombs. There is an essential connection with sexual and reproductive rights. And the first casualty of that war is the existences of trans persons, because they represent in and of themselves the essential form of freedom in relation to gender. They are the people that are at the forefront of freeing themselves, of transcending the realities of biological and genital configurations and exercising freedom. And I think that this is the connection with anti-gender agendas. It is ultimately a connection with sexual and reproductive rights. But what Ricky was alluding to very ably is that the first casualty of that war is trans women and men, because they are at the forefront and they are the most vulnerable, therefore the easiest prey. And finally, to the friends around the call, and to what I'm going to continue doing now and from day one, is I really want for people to understand that we need to place ourselves of our immediate realities. I am on the record as having established an interlocution with the United States of America because of a case in South Dakota where a gay man was condemned to the death penalty, and it is alleged that he was condemned to the death penalty because jurors thought that it was too much of, quote unquote, a prize, a reward to actually condemn him to life in prison. Because with life in prison, he would have the opportunity of actually leading, I imagine the assumption was, a life of debauchery and sexual pleasure. I am on the record as having established that interlocution. Unfortunately, I did not get a reply from the government of the United States. So to answer in a very, very circular way your wonderful question, Kate, what I'm doing every day and what I will continue doing is ensuring that states that have power go back or belong to the Human Rights Council. That is essential. And in my view, a fundamental mistake from the current administration to withdraw from the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And secondly, to continue supporting vigorously that there is no backtracking in relation to these agendas.
Thank you so much, Victor, for that very fulsome answer. And you actually answered one of the questions in the chat from Finn Kensing around the distinction between political and partisan. I think that was also what Pedro was alluding to, and I think you articulated that just completely beautifully, so thank you. We did have a question in the chat early on about the work you've been doing, both Outright International and you, Victor, on conversion therapy, and I'm happy to hear any piece of this that this might have had with your experience in Zimbabwe, Ricky as well, or any comments you might have on it, Pedro. But why don't we start with Jessica? You want to talk a little bit about Outright International's work on ending conversion therapy. This is an effort near and dear to my heart. NCLR drafted and got passed the first bill banning conversion therapy on minors in California. And through our Born Perfect campaign, their Born Perfect campaign, I do not no longer at NCLR, but I still can't stop owning them. The organization has now passed dozens of anti-conversion therapy bills in municipalities and states throughout the United States. And I know that this work is super important internationally when national actors couldn't continue to gain ground in the United States. They simply exported their hate and horrific policies. So Jessica, you want to lead us with this?
Sure, I'm happy to, Kate. And I did also want to say something about the opposition at some point in some.
Yeah, you can roll it in here, because this is the opposition is at the forefront of this among many other things. So please do.
Okay. I'll start with the specific issue of conversion therapy, and then I'll go to the broader opposition as it attacks many issues. So we say conversion therapy for shorthand, but what we really mean is so-called conversion therapy, because it's neither conversion nor therapy, but torture. And I also just want to appreciate what you said, Kate, because I believe that NCLR has done some of the most brilliant work there is in the world on the practice. And Victor, perhaps you will give a longer explanation about how some instances of conversion therapy might only amount to cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, but I'll leave that point to you, my wonderful colleague. What I want to say is something about the data outright gathered on the practice of so-called conversion therapy. What we wanted to understand were a couple of things. What is the legal status of conversion therapy around the world? And what are the main drivers of conversion therapy? And why do you need to understand the drivers? Well, because we want to put an end to the practice. And we focus primarily in the context of Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Asia. And so I just want to say, in the African context, religious leaders and institutions are by far the leading perpetrators of conversion therapy. And practices are largely traditional, including exorcisms, beatings, and so-called corrective rape. So we're talking about some of the most violent forms of enforcement of heteronormativity that you could imagine. In Latin America and the Caribbean, perpetrators are largely religious personnel or private mental health providers. And the forms of enforcement or punishment include electroshock, hormones, sedatives, immersive therapy, and other forms like that. The pattern in Asia was actually quite a bit different. And that's why it's important to have a global overview, but to take very much customized approaches locally. In Asia, Outright's data suggests that family honor and culture, more than religion, drives families and LGBTIQ people themselves to seek out so-called conversion therapy. And unfortunately, we've documented a lot of different forms of physical abuse that were the forms of aversion therapy. I think beyond the regional differences, one data point that stood out for me that I think will resonate with many people in the audience was that that many of the people that we talked with, roughly 1/3, sought conversion therapy for themselves. And I just want to sort of like ask you to sit with this fact for a moment. You know, I can remember being a young person and starting to figure out my sexuality. And I remember being a young atheist Jew and praying to the goddess to make me heterosexual, because I didn't know anybody who was like me. I didn't know anyone who was lesbian or gay. I'd only absorbed either negative images, or I had no information about LGBTIQ people. And so I just wished something would change me. And, you know, I think this experience, unfortunately, is affirmed in our data. And what it says is that unless we create cultures that affirm LGBTIQ people through law and policy, through representation in TV and film, through affirming religious communities, through loving parents, unless we develop all of those strategies, then LGBTIQ people won't be safe. And so as part of Outright's work on this subject, we're supporting the ban of conversion therapy globally. And it might disturb you to know how few countries ban conversion therapy at the federal level. So wherever you are, wherever you're listening in, just pick a number in your mind. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that it's only 5 countries in the world that have federal bans on conversion therapy. This is out of at least 193 governments globally, which says that this practice is pervasive. And for the most part, it's actually state sanctioned, because when a practice is so pervasive, but governments are either silent or in some cases even encourage the practice, then we have no choice but to hold governments accountable. And so in terms of Outright's work on the issue, it takes many levels. I've posted a couple of resources in the chat, but we have a colleague who works in Kenya who leads a lot of our work in South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, seeking to ban conversion therapy at the level of law and policy. But she's also doing work like working with traditional religious leaders to make sure to create a culture of intolerance for it. Looking to create a sort of legal toolkit to take on the hard issues. Now, imagine for yourself, what is the regulatory pathway forward for limiting or banning conversion therapy? Do you call it torture? Do you call it child abuse? Do you call it fraudulent goods and services? It really varies. And so what we're trying to do now is develop a sort of multifaceted toolkit. So that
Jessica, I'm just going to ask you just to like one more sentence, because we're going to go to 2 more questions that have been asked in the chat. I'm sorry about that. We're believe it or not, we're running out of time. I mean, this has been such a rich conversation, and I don't want to shortchange you, but if you could just.
With you.
Thank you.
I put the resources in the chat. Thank you for calling me out, Kate. This is the hard thing about Zoom. You have no idea how long you're talking. So mea culpa to my fellow.
No. You were fantastic. It was great. And I know Victor's already also doing work on this. Let's throw up Victor's research on this. But I want to go to the Q&A that we had in the chat. And what I'm going to do is oh, wait, where'd those questions go? I got bumped off. And so I think I might not have those questions, but one was for Pedro and I remember it. And then I'm going to go to you for the last one, Victor. So Pedro, the question for you in the Q&A was, what are you doing to ensure that your platforms don't harbor or encourage the very same kinds of behaviors that we are decrying here in terms of abuse of LGBTQ individuals, activists, especially those in some of the most vulnerable places. And I'm sorry I didn't capture it entirely, folks. That's enough to get it.
We have incredibly strict guidelines when it comes to and community guidelines when it comes to content that can be considered harmful or incite violence. And when that happens, we simply remove that content from the platform. We also work with a lot of experts in this field to help us understand what that looks like and feels like. We're not at all perfect all the time, but we have made tremendous progress in the last 3 to 4 years, and the platform is clearly feeling a lot safer today than ever. And we continue to evolve our guidelines, on our community guidelines, to continue to make the platform as safe as possible to all these vulnerable communities.
Thanks, Pedro. And Karen, I know you had a question for Victor, and I feel like I'm not going to capture it appropriately because you and Victor are sort of like, twin mirror images of each other in terms of your international work. Karen, if you're still on, can you just ask your question? And if not, did anyone else capture that? I think I just got bounced. You have it, Ricky?
I think I see it in the chat box.
This is Paul.
So what she asked was, she said, Victor, are you working with those who are addressing human trafficking at the UN? That's the question.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Ricky, moderator extraordinaire. Look at you. I mean, take down the Zimbabwean government and then you moderate the panel. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Well, yes, there are a number of my colleagues that actually are special rapporteurs on the issue of human trafficking. And then I would believe that there's also a connection with the special rapporteur on modern forms of slavery. But I'm not really sure that I would understand exactly what the specific, I mean, we work together in the sense that whenever we have an intersectionality, we explore it. And my colleagues, two of them dealing with this issue, were part of the 96 special rapporteurs who so kindly agreed to sign the statement on the last International Day against homophobia and transphobia, biphobia, 17th of May, about the importance of bringing LGBT people to the forefront of COVID-19 pandemic response and recovery. But I'm not able to be more specific than that. In case that there's a very specific concern, I would be happy to answer it either here or later on. Very happy, but I'm not really sure that I would see anything more specific than that, Kate.
Thank you, Victor. So we have one last question. Jessica, I'm going to come to you for this, but then what I want you to do, and everybody, I'm coming to you, word economy will be important here because we've got 5 minutes left. What I want is Jessica to quickly answer this question, and then I want you to leave this group of folks with one sentence of how to cope, how you cope, how to believe, how to hang on to hope, how to be active, how to be engaged, how to be a change maker, how to take everything we've learned here and how to wake up every morning and feel like you're doing something about something, even if you can't do everything about everything. So ruminate on that, and Jessica will give you 1 minute's head start to think about how you might answer that question. Jessica, the question to you is, do you have advice for nonprofit boards committed to showing up for vulnerable organizational staff? How can those of us in nonprofit trustee roles use our governance responsibilities to support staff who are vulnerable?
I did a quick summary in the chat. The core strategies are good health insurance, good leave policies, sensitivity trainings for board and staff, and most importantly, asking the staff what support meets them where they are. I think it's quite varied. Kate, I'm just dying to say something about the opposition.
Oh God, okay, then that's going to be your sentence.
Okay. I just want folks to understand that there's a radical resource inequality between LGBTIQ rights globally and homophobia and transphobia globally. So the total LGBTIQ rights global budget is around $560 million. And the total budget for those that work against us is around $1 billion annually. And so I just want you to sort of think in terms of action-oriented steps. What can I do? It's not just about money. It's also about volunteering. It's about using whatever resources you have, but they're outspending us and we're still winning. That gives me hope, but it also says we can do so much more.
Damn, way to go. Mic drop, perfect timing. Okay, Pedro, I'm coming to you.
Sure. I would say, start by thinking about your privilege and all the rights and things you take for granted. We vote. You can walk on the street. You can shout. You can do stuff that you take for granted today. Think about all the other people that had to work hard for you to have what you have. Just generically speaking, and this goes beyond LGBT. Now, ground yourself on that. Remind yourself that, and then think about the position of privilege you have today and what you can do with money, action, time, to work for those that don't have the same rights as you do.
Thank you, Pedro. Perfect. Victor?
Support Outright International and Casa Ruby. You'd feel so much better.
I should have said that, actually.
Instantaneously.
Yeah.
And Kate, I should also say, I mean, for 25 years, since I was 5, I've been listening to the stories of victims of human rights violations who are determined to have their life stories matter so that others don't suffer the same things. It is my enormous privilege to work with people such as Ricky and others. Listen to their stories. They will inspire you to no end.
Thank you, Victor. Co-sign all of that. Ricky, take us home.
Okay, so by the saying by Mahatma Gandhi, which goes something like this: "Be the change you want to see in the world." That's what I live by. And to explain it a bit more, so I believe it was said on this call earlier on, everyone must be an activist. Be it Pedro, be it Victor, Jessica. I'm so privileged to have known Jessica for many years now. I'm privileged to serve on the board of Outright Action International. And so with that said, I've been fighting for this change for the last 25 years, first back home and now globally, and now in the United States with Jessica. And that is it. We all need to be activists, and we all need to be the change that we want to see in the world.
Thanks so much, Ricky. All right, you have your charge. Our charge is to make Ricky proud of how we show up in the world. And if we do that, we can make great change regardless of who occupies what seats in the political spectrum. We can make a difference no matter what. Thanks so much for having us. Thanks for the organizers for pulling this all together, Rick and Nigel and Paul. It's such a pleasure to meet you all and to be able to share this time with you. You all are freaking badasses. And I love that I got to know you. I love that I got to see you, and just keep doing what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Wrap us
Have a
up.
lovely
Thank
day.
you.
Yeah, Paul, go ahead. You wrap us up.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. We appreciate this deep conversation. Want to thank Rick Mordesovich and Doug Heskey for helping bring us all together. And next time on ESGX next week, we will have a focus on our monthly Green Jobs Report. This Green Jobs Report is as a special guest, which is Sarah Nelson. She's the head of the Flight Attendants Union, which is part of the AFL-CIO, and one of the unions that's part of it. And we mentioned the words badass. She's been officially named a badass for helping to bring the general threat of a general strike to close the government shutdown of 2019, and to have a focus on how to support the jobs and skills of everyone in the workforce today during the pandemic. So please join us next week for the October Green Jobs Report, which will be the last ESGX before the US election. And then the week after the election, hopefully everybody will have voted now or before the US election, or helped monitor polling places legitimately and legally, like my wife is. The week after the election, we'll have the countdown to 2021. And so we'll have a mix of experts to bring their insights to it. So thanks again for joining today. Feel free to like this on YouTube and to share this. This is recorded so that you can share it with your friends, community, coworkers, fellow board members. And so grateful for everybody's leadership on LGBTQ rights and the ability to live a fulfilling life in collaboration with all of us. Nigel, you want to wrap us up?